True War Encounters. Full narrative. How Jake McNiece used ZB-26 in 1942 with measured fury to defend a crossroads. Forgotten. The ZB-26 sat heavy across McNiece's thighs, the bipod legs buried 3 inches into North Carolina clay. 4 hours into what was supposed to be a 6-hour hold. The crossroads lay empty under afternoon sun. 2 dirt farm roads splitting at right angles, one leading toward distant maneuver headquarters, the other vanishing into pine forest where the aggressor force had been probing since dawn. 20 rounds in the curved magazine, maybe 60 more scattered in canvas pouches around the shallow depression McNiece called a fighting position. The training exercise had started simple enough. Defend this junction. Deny the route. Hold until relieved. But simple had a way of turning complicated when 5 scattered paratroopers faced an enemy force that kept testing, kept pushing, kept looking for the weakness that would crack the line. McNiece's hands moved over the check-stamped receiver without thinking. Top-mounted magazine, clear sight picture, reliable gas system. He'd scrounged the ZB-26 from a surplus crate 2 weeks earlier, preferring its accuracy to the Browning automatic rifles most squads carried. The weapon rewarded discipline, punished wild spraying, made every trigger pull count, which meant McNiece, loud, rebellious, the kind of paratrooper who'd sooner argue with officers than salute them, had to become something his reputation said he wasn't. Patient. Movement flickered at the tree line. 200 yards out, eastern approach. McNiece counted 4 figures using cover well, advancing in staggered formation toward the southern road. His finger brushed the trigger. Every muscle screamed to fire, to announce his position with violence, to send bullets down range and make the enemy scatter. But 20 rounds wouldn't hold a crossroads for 2 more hours. 20 rounds barely held it for 20 minutes if he burned through ammunition like most men did when fear took over. So he waited. Let them advance. 150 yards, 125. His breathing slowed, despite the hammer of his heart. The ZB-26 felt alive under his hands, cold metal warming where his palms gripped wood and steel. Somewhere to his right, Corporal Hendricks shifted in his own depression, the sound of boots scraping clay loud in the quiet. "Mac," Hendricks whispered, voice tight. "They're getting close." "I know," McNiece said without moving. "Let 'em." It felt insane, like standing on train tracks watching the locomotive approach. But McNiece had learned something in demolition training that the jump school instructors never quite articulated. Timing mattered more than force. A charge detonated too early did nothing but announce your position. Detonated at the right moment, it changed everything. Same principle here. Let the enemy commit. Let them believe the crossroads was undefended. Then hit them when belief turned to vulnerability. 75 yards. McNiece could see their faces now through the simple sights. Could see confidence replacing caution. The way they'd stopped hugging cover as tightly. They thought the position was abandoned. Good. He exhaled slowly, adjusted the bipod a fraction, thumbed the selector. And when the lead figure stepped into the center of the crossroads, McNiece gave the ZB-26 3 measured bursts, 5 rounds each, 15 total. The sound cracked across the junction like breaking wood. The lead figure dropped. The second stumbled. Third and fourth dove for the ditch. McNiece stopped firing. Silence crashed down. The aggressor patrol stayed pinned, confused about the size of the defending element, uncertain whether to advance or withdraw. McNiece reloaded with deliberate calm, hands steady despite adrenaline flooding his system. 5 rounds left in the magazine, 15 expended. Crossroads still held. The math felt brutal and necessary. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The reputation preceded him even in 1942. Jake McNiece, loudmouth troublemaker, the kind of soldier who'd mock a lieutenant's orders before following them, if he followed them at all. The instructors at jump school had marked his file with notes about attitude problems and disregard for regulation. The other paratroopers in his stick had learned to expect brilliant chaos whenever McNiece got his hands on demolitions gear. But sitting behind the ZB-26 with 2 hours left and ammunition dwindling, McNiece embodied something none of them had seen before: restraint. From his position 20 yards left, Private Kowalski watched McNiece through the afternoon heat shimmer. Watched him sit motionless behind the machine gun, watched him track movement at the tree line without firing, watched him count breaths like a man timing a fuse. Kowalski had expected the loud, reckless McNiece to burn through all 60 rounds in the first contact, expected wild, suppressive fire and cocky jokes about how many aggressor troops he'd sent running. Instead, McNiece moved like a man conserving something more precious than bullets. "How's he doing that?" Kowalski muttered to Hendricks. "Doing what?" "Not shooting. Every instinct says light 'em up, but he's just waiting." Hendricks worked his jaw, eyes still on the tree line. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the crazy bastard's finally listening to something besides his own mouth. The second probe came 30 minutes later. Western approach this time. 6 figures moving through scattered brush, testing the flanks. McNiece tracked them through the sights, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. 100 yards, 80, 60. Kowalski's hands trembled on his own rifle, waiting for McNiece to open up, waiting for the signal that would turn the crossroads into a firefight. McNiece let them reach 40 yards before firing. 2 bursts. 7 rounds total. 1 figure went down. The others scattered into cover, pinned and confused. McNiece stopped, reloaded, checked his ammunition pouches with the same methodical calm he'd shown all afternoon. 43 rounds expended, maybe 50 remaining. 4 hours down. 2 to go. The paradox wasn't lost on Lieutenant Morrison, observing from the command post half a mile back. He'd expected McNiece to be the first casualty of this exercise. Aggressive, reckless, burning through resources and getting his position overrun within the first hour. Instead, radio reports kept coming back with the same impossible message: crossroads held, minimal ammunition expended, enemy probes repelled with precision fire. Morrison studied the training map, trying to reconcile what he knew about McNiece with what the ground was telling him. The aggressor force had committed nearly a platoon to taking that junction. By any tactical calculation, 5 scattered defenders should have been overwhelmed or forced to withdraw. But McNiece had transformed the crossroads into something it shouldn't be: a fortress defended not by numbers, but by the brutal economy of measured violence. "Sir," the radio operator said, "Aggressor Commander is requesting clarification on defender strength at the junction." Morrison almost smiled. "Tell him we have 1 squad element in position." He didn't mention that the element was 5 paratroopers and 1 demolition NCO who'd somehow learned that the loudest rebellion could be silence, and the most aggressive choice could be patience. The sun crawled toward the horizon. 5th hour. McNiece's hands ached from gripping the ZB-26, from staying ready without firing, from holding tension like a live wire. Sweat soaked through his uniform despite the mild October weather. The crossroads shimmered in late afternoon light, empty except for the scars of earlier contacts, disturbed dirt where bodies had fallen during blank-fire portions of the exercise, abandoned gear from aggressor troops who'd withdrawn under his measured bursts. 47 rounds remaining, 1 hour to hold. From the tree line, movement suggested the aggressor force was massing for something bigger. McNiece could feel it in the pattern of their probes, in the way small elements had tested different approaches all afternoon. They were learning his rhythm, mapping his position, preparing for a coordinated push that would overwhelm individual firing points through sheer mass. "They're coming with everything," Hendricks said from his position. His voice carried the strain of 5 hours under pressure. "Mac, we can't hold against a full assault with what we've got left." McNiece didn't answer immediately. He was doing math in his head. 47 rounds, maybe 6 approach vectors. Best case scenario, 7 rounds per vector if he distributed fire perfectly. Worst case, concentrated assault from one direction that would require sustained fire he couldn't afford. "We hold until we're relieved," McNiece said finally. "That's the mission. The mission assumed we'd have support. Assumed we'd have ammunition." "Yeah, well, assumptions get you killed." The words came out harder than McNiece intended, but Hendricks was saying out loud what McNiece had been thinking for the past hour, that somewhere in the planning, someone had miscalculated, that 5 men with limited ammunition couldn't realistically hold this junction against a determined force, that the simple mission had been anything but simple from the moment they'd taken position at dawn. But McNiece also knew something else, something he'd learned watching demolition charges fail or succeed based on nothing but timing and nerve. You didn't abandon a position because it was hard. You found a way to make the impossible work, even if that meant rewriting every instinct that screamed for you to cut and run. News filtered in through radio chatter. Other units across the maneuver area were reporting mixed results. Some positions overrun, others holding but requesting resupply. The training cadre was watching everything, scoring every decision, every shot, every choice made under pressure. This wasn't just about defending a crossroads, it was about proving something to the army, to the other paratroopers, maybe to himself. Kowalski crawled over from his position, moving low through the depression. "Mac, I got maybe 20 rounds left myself. Hendricks is down to his last magazine. If they hit us hard, then we make every round count," McNiece said. He looked at Kowalski, seeing the fear there, the exhaustion, the desperate hope that someone had a plan beyond hold until relieved. "Listen to me. When they come, you don't fire until I fire. You follow my rhythm. You trust the discipline. Understand?" Kowalski nodded slowly, though his eyes showed doubt. McNiece returned his attention to the tree line. Somewhere out there, the aggressor force was preparing their final push. And somewhere inside himself, McNiece felt the weight of what he was asking, that 5 terrified men trust the patience of someone known for having none, that they believe restraint could save them when every instinct screamed for violence. The ZB-26 waited in his hands, heavy and certain. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. They came in the 6th hour, just as shadows lengthened across the crossroads. McNiece counted silhouettes emerging from multiple tree lines. Northern approach, eastern, southern. Maybe 20 figures total, moving in coordinated bounds, using cover well, advancing with the confidence of numbers. This wasn't a probe, this was the final push. Time for when they believed the defenders were exhausted, low on ammunition, ready to break. McNiece's hands settled into position on the ZB-26, 47 rounds in pouches, 1 magazine seated. The math was simple and brutal. Not enough for sustained fire, barely enough for precision bursts, just enough if every single round found purpose. The aggressor force closed to 100 yards. McNiece watched them commit, watched them cross the psychological threshold where withdrawal would cost more than advancing. His finger rested on the trigger. Breath slowed. Heart hammered, but hands stayed steady. The crossroads felt smaller now, compressed by the weight of converging movement, by the knowledge that the next 60 seconds would determine whether 5 men held or collapsed. At 75 yards, McNiece opened fire. 3 rounds into the Northern Element's lead figure. The man went down. McNiece traversed left without pause, found the eastern approach, gave them 4 rounds that sent 2 figures diving for cover. Traversed right, southern approach, another 3-round burst. The ZB-26 spoke with measured authority, short, controlled, economical. No wild spraying, no panic, just the brutal arithmetic of making every bullet count. The aggressor force faltered. They'd expected resistance, but not this. Not precision fire from a position that should be desperate and depleted. McNiece reloaded, hands moving with practiced speed, and immediately placed single bursts into any figure that tried to advance. The pattern repeated: movement, fire, silence. Movement, fire, silence. Each burst fractional, controlled, calculated to maximum effect with minimum expenditure. Kowalski and Hendricks followed his rhythm. Their own fire came in short, disciplined bursts, matching McNiece's economy. The crossroads transformed from a tactical weakness into a killing ground, where every approach found measured resistance, where confidence met mathematics, where numbers meant nothing against the cold precision of men who understood that restraint was its own kind of violence. McNiece's final magazine clicked empty at round 14. He'd saved 8 rounds. The assault had stalled at 40 yards, the aggressor force pinned and confused. Their coordinated push fractured by fire discipline they hadn't anticipated. McNiece sat motionless, hands on the silent ZB-26, watching them reassess. Then the relief element arrived, fresh paratroopers moving up from the rear, their appearance breaking the stalemate, forcing the aggressor force to withdraw into the tree lines. The crossroads fell quiet. 6 hours. Held. McNiece didn't move. Didn't celebrate. Just sat there, feeling the ZB-26's warmth fade under his hands, feeling the weight of what they'd done settle into his bones. Around him, Kowalski and Hendricks stared with something between exhaustion and disbelief. They'd held. Against numbers, against tactics, against every reasonable expectation. They'd held because one loudmouth demolition NCO had transformed fury into measured precision. 3 days later, McNiece sat alone in the barracks, cleaning the ZB-26 with methodical care. His hands moved over the receiver, the barrel, the bipod legs, removing North Carolina clay with the same deliberate patience he'd shown at the crossroads. Around him, other paratroopers prepared for the next phase of training, but McNiece worked in silence, wrestling with something he couldn't quite name. The training cadre's after-action review had been brief. Exemplary fire discipline, tactical patience, measured aggression under sustained pressure. Words that seemed wrong attached to his name, to his reputation, to the file that marked him as undisciplined and rebellious. The other men had clapped him on the back, bought him drinks, told him the crossroads defense would be legendary. But McNiece felt something else beneath the praise. Fear. Not the fear of contact or combat. That was simple. Manageable, something you pushed through or used as fuel. This was deeper. The fear of what he'd discovered about himself at that junction, about the control required to sit motionless while every instinct screamed to act, about the weight of 5 men's lives depending on his ability to transform rage into precision. The fear that this was who he really was beneath the jokes and insubordination. Someone capable of extreme discipline when the stakes demanded it. Someone who could carry responsibility he'd spent years pretending not to want. The secret wasn't what happened at the crossroads. The official record had that part mostly right. The secret was what it cost internally, the grinding effort of controlling himself, of counting rounds like heartbeats, of holding fire when his hands shook with the need to empty the magazine. Every moment of restraint had been a small death of instinct, a forced suppression of the impulse to survive through volume and aggression. Corporal Hendricks found him there, boots still muddy from field exercises. Cadre wants to write you up for commendation. Superior performance under pressure, all that. McNiece kept cleaning the ZB-26. They can write whatever they want. You don't seem happy about it. I'm not unhappy, just... McNiece paused, searching for words. You know how many times I almost broke? How many times I wanted to just burn through every round and call it enough? Hendricks sat down on the adjacent bunk. But you didn't. No, because if I did, we'd all be marked as casualties in some review, and the crossroads would have fallen. So I sat there counting breaths and rounds like my life depended on it. Which it did. Which yours did. McNiece set down the cleaning rod. That's not heroic. That's just being too stubborn to quit and too scared to fail. Sounds like the definition of courage to me. McNiece almost laughed. But the sound died in his throat because Hendricks was right and wrong simultaneously. Courage was part of it. But so was the exhausting weight of control, the private battle against his own nature, the knowledge that the legend people would tell about the crossroads would be cleaner than the truth. They'd remember the precision fire and tactical patience. They wouldn't remember the trembling hands between contacts, the silent prayers that the aggressor force would withdraw before his ammunition ran out, the crushing responsibility of being the man everyone looked to for decisions when nothing felt certain. The ZB-26 sat between them, cleaned and silent. McNiece traced the check stamp on the receiver, feeling the metal cool under his fingertips. Measured fury. That's what it had been. Rebellion transformed into discipline, chaos compressed into precision, and the cost was carrying forward the knowledge that he was capable of more control than he'd ever wanted to admit. The years turned McNiece's Crossroads defense into one of those stories told in jump school and training cadres. Some versions exaggerated, 50 aggressor troops repelled, 100 rounds expended with surgical precision, a single paratrooper holding against impossible odds. Other versions softened the details, made it cleaner, turned 6 hours of grinding tension into a few heroic minutes. None of them captured what McNiece carried forward from that October afternoon in North Carolina. In 1944, when he jumped into Normandy with the Filthy 13, the lesson of the ZB-26 lived in his hands. When demolition charges had to be placed under fire, when timing meant the difference between saving paratroopers and losing them, when fury threatened to overwhelm precision, he remembered the crossroads, remembered that restraint could be aggression, that patience could save lives, that the loudest rebellion sometimes required the quietest discipline. His reputation as a troublemaker never changed. He still mocked officers, still broke regulations, still carried the attitude that made commanders simultaneously want to court-martial and promote him. But underneath, in the spaces between orders and instinct, McNiece held something forged in North Carolina clay. The knowledge that he could control himself when everything depended on it, that measured fury was its own kind of power, that the weight of responsibility didn't require losing the sharp edges that made him who he was. Decades later, a young historian researching the 101st Airborne found records of the training exercise, found McNiece's name in after-action reports about exemplary fire discipline at a crossroads defense, found notes about a Czech ZB-26 and 43 rounds expended over 6 hours. The historian asked McNiece about it in a letter, curious about this forgotten moment before the war, before the legend, before the Filthy 13 became famous. McNiece's response was brief. "We held because we had to. Everything else is just details people remember wrong." He didn't mention the trembling hands or the math of survival. Didn't explain how sitting behind that machine gun had taught him more about himself than all the demolitions training and jump school combined. Didn't describe the cost of control or the fear of discovering capabilities he'd spent years avoiding. The historian received a simple anecdote about a training exercise and wrote it into a footnote that maybe 3 people ever read. But McNiece knew, and the men who'd been there, Kowalski, Hendricks, the others, they knew too. They'd watched rebellion transform into discipline, watched fury become measured and precise, watched a troublemaker carry the weight of lives depending on choices made in fractions of seconds. That knowledge lived in glances exchanged across reunions, in silences that spoke louder than stories, in the understanding that legends are always lighter than memories. The ZB-26 itself was lost somewhere in the chaos of war, returned to some depot or destroyed in some forgotten action. But the lesson it taught remained, that the line between recklessness and courage was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, that discipline could coexist with rebellion, that measured fury was the hardest kind of strength to maintain, and sometimes the only kind that mattered. McNiece carried it all forward. Through Normandy, through Market Garden, through every demolition under fire and every impossible choice. The crossroads in North Carolina became the foundation everything else was built on, the proof that he could be both who he was and who the moment required, the weight he'd carry long after the shooting stopped, and the legend simplified what actually happened into something easier to tell. That was the real story, not the version in reports or the footnote in history books. The version lived quietly in the spaces between heartbeats and trigger pulls, in the mathematics of survival, in the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing was knowing exactly when not to fire. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.